We're in the midst of a key meeting in Brussels as leaders from around Europe try and calm the markets and bring the Eurozone back from the brink. So I'm delighted to welcome one of the key thinkers in Brussels, Fredrik Erixon. So thank you for joining me today in the studio. So the task seems relatively simple, doesn't it? Sovereign nations need to sort out their own finances. And in the meantime, the ECB and IMF can step in the short term.
Well, I think that's something we could perhaps hope for, but I'm not so sure it's going to happen. I mean, we are very late in the crisis right now. Eurozone leaders have had many opportunities to do the right things in the past 2 years, but they have been extremely determined to not use those chances. The question is, are they going to step up this time and actually do what is necessary in order to save the entire Eurozone from collapsing? I think the conditions now are much better than they have been in the past years, but it remains to be seen if there's going to be enough willingness and support to do what's necessary.
I'm sure you monitor these summits in Brussels very closely. So how do they work in practical terms? Is it just a case of Angela Merkel at the end of a big long table with a stick, or is it a case of lots of civil servants running around?
They are very chaotic, and they are usually done in a very anemic building with, of course, lots of journalists that also are hanging around. I think one of the problems that we have seen in the course of the past 2 years is that no one of the big country leaders has been willing to step up to offer the sort of leadership that is necessary in order to take Eurozone through the crisis. I think one of the problems with Angela Merkel is that she has been absent. She hasn't done what is required from the biggest Eurozone economy. I think we are seeing a German chancellor who is much more keen to lead now. She's not having that stick, but at least she has enough leverage, I think, to force through what Germany wants in exchange for putting up the cash that other countries are in need of, but also perhaps for giving some sort of an implicit agreement that ECB now can step into the bond markets to far more greater degree than they've done in the past years.
So what are the most immediate problems which need to be solved? I was reading a report by yours, and you seem to be very concerned about the true state of the banking system within the Eurozone.
The banking system is extremely fragile. We have seen the ECB today launching new tools for banks to refinance themselves, which I think is absolutely critical for many of the banks to actually survive the next 2 quarters, the next 3 quarters. In addition to that, there are many other things that needs to be done as well on the banking side. We don't know yet the consequences of the haircut that banks are going to take in Greece and what sort of consequences that's going to have for the banking system. We don't really know how fragile the Eurozone banking system is in its exposure towards Italy and the sort of problems that we're seeing there right now. In addition to that, I think we've been living in a sort of cuckoo land in the past years as far as recapitalization and capital adequacy ratio for banks are concerned. I mean, what we're seeing now and what we saw in the deal that was fleshed out in Brussels in late October is that they're going to force upon banks much higher capital standards, and I think if they're going to do that at this pace right now, you're going to see an enormous contraction in bank credit, in lending in Europe, and I think that's going to have a remarkable effect in slowing down economic growth, the anemic growth we have in Europe. So I think we need to be extremely careful in the way that we're toying with these regulations right now, and I would say it's much better to focus now on banks' ability to refinance themselves on the short-term lending market, and then you deal with the long-term structural issues with banks when we're out of this immediate crisis.
There was a lot of hopes pinned on the likes of the IMF, China, emerging economies to buy sovereign bonds in the Eurozone. From an investor's point of view, sovereign bonds in Europe don't seem particularly attractive. So do you think that these countries will be willing and are willing to step in and try and buy more Eurozone sovereign bonds?
It depends. I think it depends on the circumstances and exactly what they are going to buy. I think no other country in the world, as you know, I think this is true for other European countries as well, they're not willing to throw money into a black hole. If they are going to participate in any sort of operation which actually means buying sovereign bonds, it has to be done in a way which is giving them the assurances they need that these bonds are not going to lose half the value, the full value in half a year, 2 years, 5 years. So I think it depends entirely on the arrangement for that. What I've been arguing for in the past and for a quite long time now is that there is not going to be a solution to the bond market problems in Europe unless the IMF can step in to a far more greater degree than we've seen through their Troika cooperation in lending to Greece, Ireland and Portugal. I think the IMF has the possibility to tap resources that Eurozone governments themselves don't have. They also have the expertise and the experience that you need in order to deal with sovereign crises. The European Commission, the European Central Bank simply don't have that experience. And I think we have seen that time and again in the past 2 years that they are not really fit for purpose when it comes to dealing with sovereign crises.
Sure, I just want to turn our attention to the monitors behind us. These are predicted growth rates for certain countries in the Eurozone next year by Eurostat. Some might say they're even a bit ambitious. How do these countries like Italy and Spain, who have this very low growth, but at the same time they have to implement this tough austerity and cutbacks, how do they get out of this almost vicious cycle of cutbacks and slow economic growth?
Well, I think there isn't a universal answer to that for European countries. First of all, I think these figures are vastly optimistic. The ECB came out with a forecast today saying that Eurozone growth is going to be somewhere between 0.4% and 1% for 2012. I think even that may be erring on the side of optimism. Europe is going to be lucky if it can maintain zero growth for 2012, perhaps even for 2013. So what we then are seeing in a couple of countries is you have one group of countries which is like Greece, where the country is in a vicious cycle. It's in a depression, and no austerity measures is going to change that. So forcing new type of austerity programs on Greece simply is not going to have the intended effect, because when you are in a contracting economy, you can't really get back to budget balance by cutting expenditures and raising taxes. I think what Greece needs to do is to reorient the focus in economic policy entirely away from the sort of austerity focus it has had in the past 18 months and concentrate on deep, radical structural economic reforms that can increase productivity and competitiveness in Greece. Because if that doesn't happen, if growth is not going to return to Greece, the whole economy is going to shrink. So you have one group which is like Greece. I think I would also like to put Italy into that corner. Italy's problem isn't really about budget balance. Its primary fiscal surplus is actually quite good, and as long as economic growth is going to return to its trend before the crisis, Italy is fine. I think the medium to long-term problem for Italy is that it must raise its economic growth, because what has happened in the past decade is, of course, that at the low levels of economic growth it has had, it hasn't been able to fund all the sort of expenditures items that it wanted to pay for through the budget. So deficits have been almost constant, and public debt has gone up. And now we're at a point where public debt in Italy needs to go down, and needs to go down quite sharply. And for that to happen, economic growth must increase. So again, even for Italy, concentrate entirely on economic growth. Then you have another group of countries, which are countries like Germany, Austria, Netherlands, Finland, Sweden and others, which are basically competitive economies. And they have, if they like, a chance to increase spending, if they like. They have a chance to cut taxes because they have the financial room of maneuver to do that. I think they should do that cautiously. I think they shouldn't do it to the degree that they're going to jeopardize their own fiscal status by increasing borrowing rates by spending more money on fiscal stimuluses, but they have a chance to do a little bit more. So those countries are on the other extreme. In between, you have a few other countries like France, Belgium, and others where they need to work much more with fiscal discipline. and they need to work much more with fiscal discipline next year and 2013, because they have serious credibility problems right now and are at the risk of seeing sharply rising borrowing costs because fiscal policy is so irresponsible.
Sure. I just want to draw a line under this part of the conversation. When we all wake up on Monday morning drinking our coffee, what do you think will be the headlines after the meeting taking place on Thursday and Friday?
Well, I hope that we're going to wake up and say, I think Eurozone leaders now get it. I think they have at least laid the ground for a crisis fighting policy which is going to work. What we've seen in previous crisis summers is that they have actually worsened the crisis, because they have demonstrated to markets and electorate that these political leaders don't have what it takes to solve the crisis. So I hope we're going to wake up with the opposite feeling on Monday, and feeling they are on the right track. There are lots of more things that needs to be done, but they are on the right track, and there is a chance we can actually achieve stability in the Eurozone.
Do you think that will happen, or?
I'd say there's a 50-50 chance it will happen. In normal circumstances, I would say that the chance was even higher. But when you look back and see the determination with which they've decided not to solve crisis in the past, that also give me, sadly, a little bit more skepticism in my bets.